Welcome back. I'm Dr. Cheek and I'm a licensed clinical psychologist. And today we're going to talk a little bit about something I found interesting while I was in graduate school. And what I found interesting was that there were not a lot of Black psychologists that were mentioned as being influential or being contributory to the field of psychology. And this was very interesting to me because we never even spoke of a Black psychologist, even in the diversity course that I had to take in graduate school. So that had me wondering if there were any Black psychologists that were influential or contributed to the field of psychology that just was not taught in graduate school. So I started to do some research on my own, and there are some individuals I found that were very influential and very prominent in the field of psychology. And the ones that I'm going to be talking about today are those primarily based in America. So I'm talking about U.S. psychologists. Now I know that there are others in the diaspora who contributed to psychology, but it just may take some additional time to research those. But of the ones that I've found, I'm going to talk about at least 3 or 4 of them today. So if you were also wondering if there were influential Black psychologists that contributed to the field of psychology, then the answer is yes. And these are just a mention of some of the few that I was able to find. Now, the very first one is Beverly Inez. She was the very first Black African-American woman to get her PhD in psychology in, I believe, was 1933. And she was influential in that she not only was the first woman, but she worked a lot in education, and her dissertation was on looking at the effects of being in a segregated school as opposed to being in a mixed race school on the personality or the social well-being of Black children. And what her study found was that children tended to do better socially in a segregated school. She found that Black students who were in mixed race schools tended to be more socially isolated. They tended to be introverted. They had a tendency to feel inferior to their other classmates. They had a tendency to feel less secure socially. And they also tended to have problems with their family outside of the school dynamic. But she also went on to say that she didn't recommend that students necessarily have to be placed in a segregated school to thrive, because what her counterpart found in a previous study was that Black children did about the same academically in mixed race schools as they did in segregated schools. So what she did discuss was the effect on a child's psyche or their mental health as it related to being in a mixed race school where all of their pupils were predominantly white, or all of their teachers were white as well. She found that in those environments, Black children were less likely to receive a certain types of affection from their teachers, and this led to those social insecurities or feeling isolated. Now, even to this day, there are current studies that demonstrate that in most school systems where there is a disproportionate amount of maybe white teachers or a predominantly white student body, the Black students are at a greater likelihood of receiving disciplinary actions or being treated differently or getting sent to in-school suspension or out-of-school suspension or seen as a behavioral risk. And there are also studies that show that Black males are more likely to be placed in special education classrooms due to testing than their other counterparts. So her study, although it was done in the 1930s, those findings continue to persist to this day. Although integration allowed for Black students to have greater access to education programs and materials that they did not have access to in segregated schools because of funding issues, because most of the segregated Black schools did not receive the same level of funding. They didn't have the same level of access to certain programs, certain educational materials, and certain opportunities. So what they found is that students did have greater access to academic achievement because they had greater access to those programs or those academic materials that they did not have access to in the segregated schools. But also the studies over the years have shown is that when integration happened, we lost a lot of our Black educators. And this is something that is very close to me personally because I grew up in an environment where all of the people who had position of power in my school system look like me. So most of my teachers look like me, my principals look like me, the assistant principals look like me, the office staff look like me. So throughout my entire elementary school, middle school, and high school years, I never really felt inferior. I never really felt like I didn't fit in. I never really felt like I wasn't seen. I never really felt like I had to be the representative for my entire culture. I felt like I was able to be an individual capable of making mistakes and capable of having my mistakes being seen simply as mistakes and not an intellectual deficit that I had. And I didn't really feel that level of oppression or the desire to try to make me feel inferior until I started to go to college. So you tended to feel out of place sometimes. So this is something really dear to me because I feel like having the ability to grow up in this environment gave me the ability to not feel like or see myself as less than in other environments when I got older. Because I had this experience in my developmental years, I had a greater level of self-confidence in my ability in my placement that I never felt inferior. I never felt out of place in certain situations where some people who did not have a similar experience may feel like they don't belong or may feel like they aren't doing as well as their white counterparts. I rarely had that feeling. And I attribute that to growing up in an environment where who I was not taken as a detriment to what I was capable of doing. I think it would have been beneficial with integration if we took not only the students and integrated them into that school system to have greater access, but we also took the educators as well. And that's just my personal opinion as a psychologist. Now, the second person I want to talk about is Dr. Robert William II. He was the one who created and coined the term Ebonics, which is now called African American Vernacular English. And he also co-founded the Association of Black Psychologists in 1968. What I found most interesting about Dr. Williams is that he created an assessment, an IQ assessment called the Bitch 100. And the Bitch 100 stood for Black Intelligence Test of Cultural Homogeneity. And this assessment he created was to demonstrate that if we measured IQ based on cultural understandings, then Black students would perform higher on those assessments than white students. And that turned out to be the case for his particular assessment. And he did this because when he was a child, he was asked to do an IQ test, and the IQ test results noted that he would be better suited for work as a laborer and not so much in intellectual pursuits. But he went on to get his doctorate in psychology, and he determined that there is a racial bias in some of the IQ testing or standardized testing, and that has been tested over the years. And there are certain assessments that we utilize even today, because I used to do assessments that are culturally based. They are looking for things that are culturally based that may not be taught universally to everyone, but they're tested universally on everyone. So even the IQ tests have gone through evolutions of change because of the bias inherent in those tests before those changes were made. He used his experience in standardized testing to demonstrate that there is a cultural bias in standardized testing, and that has been proven and tested throughout the years. Now, third, I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Francis Sumner. He was considered the father of Black psychology. He was the first African American male to receive a doctorate in psychology, and he received his doctorate in psychology in 1928. He also was influential in getting a psychology department started at Howard University, which is a HBCU. And for those who don't know, an HBCU is a historically Black college or university. Now, I also want to talk a little bit about present day psychologists that are influential, and those that I've talked about thus far have passed. And I think Dr. William passed away in 2020. Dr. Inez passed away a year after receiving her doctorate, which is kind of sad because I would like to have known a little bit more about her research and what she could have looked into and thought about or put into place as far as psychology was concerned moving forward. So lastly, I want to talk a little bit about someone who's not a psychologist, but who has a master's in clinical psychology, who has a doctorate in social work research. And she has been very influential in the field of mental health, and that's Dr. Joy DeGruy. Dr. DeGruy was the first one to introduce the theory of the post-traumatic slave syndrome. And the post-traumatic slave syndrome looks at the behaviors or the survival instincts of Black individuals who are descendants of former slaves, and highlighting how those behaviors were learned through years of having to deal with very traumatic experiences, and how those behaviors show up for present-day Black Americans who were descendants of slaves. And a lot of you may have heard of intergenerational trauma. And you've heard of intergenerational trauma because it's one that's more nationally known or more recognized in the field of psychology. And it's recognized because it focused on the transmission of traumatic behaviors or the transmission of learned behaviors based off previous traumatic experiences. And this was done through the study of descendants of Holocaust survivors and seeing how the experience of those who survived the Holocaust, those behaviors played out or are seen in their children. And what I find interesting about this is that in America, where we had 400 years of slavery, we had some years of Jim Crow, we had some years of the civil rights movement, and a lot of different traumatic experiences for Black Americans, there has never been like a national study of African Americans and their experience or that intergenerational trauma that they have experienced. And also, it hasn't been studied in Native Americans either, that I believe. And those for Native Americans who are having to live on reservations or having their children being forced to go to assimilation schools. All of these experiences that others have had in America that the focus has not been placed on. I included Dr. DeGruy because she filled the gap for something that was needed in that time. So what I hope you take from today's video is this. There are a lot of influential Black psychologists, social workers, mental health practitioners that we may or may not learn about in graduate school, especially if you go to a predominantly white institution. I imagine that during a doctorate program in a historically Black college and university, you have a little bit more firsthand knowledge and courses geared towards learning about these individuals. That was not my experience, and I imagine that was not the experience of a lot of other individuals. So I encourage you to do your research. I encourage you to look for those providers, and I encourage you to kind of jot down or let me know of some that you felt like you would want to mention or you learned about that you felt have been very influential in psychology that you wished were a part of your curriculum while you were in school, or that you learned about while you were in school that some of us may not have had the opportunity to learn about, that don't necessarily have to be American, but they are influential in the field of mental health. Please feel free to add those down below and give us that information and that insight, because a lot of learning takes place outside of the school setting. And if you've been to college, you know that firsthand. So that's what I want you to take from this video, and that's what I want you to add to this video. As always, please feel free to jot down any thoughts, questions, or comments that you have below. I hope you've learned something from today's video. I thank you for taking the time to listen, and I'll be seeing you again very soon. Thank you.